Hey, everybody. So Donald Trump held a press conference yesterday where he announced his takeover of law enforcement in Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to say right off the bat, I know, on one level, this is just Trump trying to distract from his connections to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And that's going to be true of pretty much everything he does from here on out. But it's also dangerous. And I think we do need to talk about it. And I'm going to explain today how his news conference yesterday was just fascist to the core. And in some ways, it is hard to take it seriously because it was a clown show, as usual. Like most authoritarians and mob bosses, Trump has elevated people like Pete Hegseth and Jeanine Pirro into high positions, not based on their expertise, but based on their personal loyalty to himself. That's what this kind of person does, you know. And so their willingness to cooperate with even his most absurd plans, that qualifies them in Trump's eyes and in the eyes of other mob boss types. So some of the worst people in America surrounded Trump yesterday on the podium. And I don't want us to get used to that. I think we should pay attention. You know, that visual in and of itself tells us so much about how fascism works. And you don't get to be on the podium with the big guy unless you prove your willingness to sell your soul for a little bit of power. But we'll have other days to talk about the sycophants around Trump. Today, I just want to focus on 5 specific fascist tactics that Trump used in that one press conference. And if you're new here, my name is Pat Kahnke. I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years. I was a former Republican until Donald Trump, and I left the party because of Trump and because the GOP has proven that they like what Trump is doing. And I've specifically been raising an alarm about the link between the church and Trump's corrupt MAGA movement. I write and talk about this stuff because Christians, or at least a lot of people who call themselves Christians, are at the center of the ugliest American political movement in our lifetime. When we look at the abuses of this administration, we've just got to remember that 3 times now, white evangelical Christians have supported Trump at a rate of about 80%. So if that's you, before you leave your comment about abortion or about the lesser of two evils or some other excuse that I've heard thousands of times by now, I just want to remind you that it was white evangelicals who overwhelmingly supported Trump in the primaries. It was white evangelicals who chose Trump over every other Republican candidate. So you can leave your comment if it makes you happy to do that. But your lesser of two evils argument just doesn't carry any weight on this channel. White evangelicals voted for Donald Trump 3 times because they like him. And I'm having a harder time every day separating Trump's fascist tendencies from his followers. Fascists can only rise to power if they rile up a mob, a strong mob. And they do that through appeals to bigotry. And it's usually religious bigotry or racial bigotry or cultural bigotry. And Donald Trump has served all 3 of those forms of bigotry up to white evangelicals for 10 years now. And they've told us at a rate of 80% in the past 3 elections, they've told us by their vote that all 3 of those forms of bigotry that he's serving up to them taste pretty good to them. So that's why I do this. I'm not trying to convince people who like Trump anymore. I tried that for years. Now I'm just trying to send a clear message to other sincere Christians that if maybe you don't like Trump, but you still vote for him or you vote for his party. I just need to tell you that if you don't speak out against the way Trump and his movement are exploiting the name of Christ now, after everything we've seen, then you're part of the problem. And I think it's time to quit being defensive about a vote or 2 or 3 that you made in the past and just get off the side of the criminal mob boss in the Oval Office. So anyway, that's why I make these videos, and that's why I write my books. So this is the 3rd video in a series that I'm doing on fascism and how it shows up in the Trump administration. My big plan was to make several videos introducing what fascism is, and then a bunch more talking about the tactics that fascists use. And I'm still going to do that, But I've decided along the way that I need to do videos like this where I address some things that are happening in real time, even before I make separate videos explaining, in detail how these tactics all work. So you can find all the videos in this series in this Are We Fascist Yet playlist on my Culture, Faith, and Politics channel. So like I said, Trump hit 5 of Jason Stanley's 10 tactics of fascism really hard yesterday. And if you want a great explanation from Jason Stanley himself of what those 10 tactics are, and there are others, but he talks about 10, you can watch his video about those tactics. I'll link to that below in the description below. So let's just take the 5 of those 10 that Trump used yesterday, one by one. And the first one is something that you'll see in every one of Trump's speeches, his news conferences, even his social media posts. Every time he says, "Make America great again," he's appealing to this tactic, which is rhetoric around the mythic past, America's mythic past. Jason Stanley, in his book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, says this: "Fascist politics invokes a pure mythic past, tragically destroyed. Depending on how the nation is defined, the mythic past may be religiously pure, racially pure, culturally pure, or all of the above." And that's why I said that fascist leaders appeal to religious bigotry or racial bigotry or cultural bigotry. And it's pretty disturbing to me, as a guy who pastored evangelical churches for 20 years, that white evangelicals have proven to be the most receptive audience for this tactic. So in all the quotes I'm going to share today, you're going to see how Trump is appealing to a time when America was great, before they took over, whoever they happened to be in his message of the day, before they took over and started ruining things. This mythic past messaging hangs over everything he does and says. And again, it's summarized in "Make America Great Again." And it showed up in his news conference when he said things like, "This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back." He's intentionally framing the present as in this fallen state, and the past was somehow glorious, requiring a return to the real Washington, D.C. in this case, a pure, orderly capital that he's taking back from corrupt hands. And he's doing what all fascists do. He's putting himself in the role of a military liberator who's going to restore the city or the nation to its former glory. So as I go through the other tactics today, you're going to see that they do overlap with each other all the time. They work together. And this mythic past rhetoric runs through all of the other tactics too. You'll hear that tone throughout these other quotes from him. But more specifically, then onto the second tactic. In yesterday's news conference, Trump leaned hard into that law and order tactic. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel, a law and order, and I've written about it in both of my books. And I've said that fascists and authoritarians always reduce the idea of justice down to 2 words, law and order. And I've said that this is a perversion of biblical justice. And it makes me sad to see so many Christians embracing this sort of language, law and order, instead of talking about the way the Bible talks about justice. In Jason Stanley's video, which I'm linking to below, he says, law and order structures who's legitimate and who's not. And he says, law and order in fascist politics means the members of a minority group who accept their subservient role, they're law-abiding. And the members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are law-abiding. By definition, the leader can't violate law and order. So law and order doesn't mean justice. And Trump explicitly referenced law and order in his official White House memo about what he's doing in D.C. The title of the memo was Restoring Law and Order in the District of Columbia. And Trump said, "The mobilization and duration of duty shall remain in effect until I determine that conditions of law and order have been restored in the District of Columbia." So keep in mind that Jason Stanley first talked about all this stuff before Trump became president, and he's building on decades of scholarship. It's not like he was trying to fit his tactics to Donald Trump. It's just that fascism, when it works together as a pattern, all these different tactics, it's a recognizable pattern of tactics. And Trump simply is a fascist. It doesn't matter what he calls himself. Fascism is as fascism does. And Trump does all the classic fascist law and order things. He demonizes the other, and he talks about how they're violent, the other is violent, and they have to be kept in line. But when thousands of crazed white Christians, or at least people who call themselves Christians, who think they're Christians, stormed the Capitol on January 6th and physically assaulted cops, Trump pardoned them on the first day of his second term. They're white. Most of them, like I said, would call themselves Christians. And every one of them was part of his cult. So law and order doesn't apply to them. Their actions are justified somehow. They're by their very white Christian Trump cultish nature, law-abiding. So if they're storming the Capitol, that must be a law-abiding thing to do. And of course, even though Trump himself has been convicted of dozens of felonies, and even though he only escaped prosecution on many more indictments because white evangelicals made him president again, so those indictments had to be dropped, law and order just doesn't apply to Trump. The reason I know that most of his white evangelical supporters are fascist at heart is because they voted for him and they scoff at the charges against him. They agree with Jason Stanley. By definition, their dear leader cannot violate law and order. So that's distressing, but this is where we're at. I think I'm describing reality here, unfortunately, which leads me to the third tactic, unreality. Jason Stanley says, fascism involves the leader setting the rules about what's true and false. The leader is setting the rules. It's only true or false if the leader says it's true or false. If you're going to rip the heart out of democracy, he says, you get people used to lies. And Trump is creating an alternate reality, in this case, about violent crime in Washington, D.C. Despite studies that have shown that violent crime plummeted in 2024 and has gone down even further this year, and despite many categories of violent crime in D.C. being at their lowest rates in many decades, Trump just scoffs at those statistics and he paints a completely false picture. It's what he's always done. So in the news conference yesterday regarding D.C. crime statistics, Trump alleges without evidence that some guy apparently who worked in the statistics department or something quit rather than give fake numbers that they were trying to get him to get, showing that crime is going down. So then Trump says, it's not going down. Under Biden, it was a disaster and nobody did anything about it. So he knows that all the real news stations are going to just run the actual statistics. But he's drawing a line in the sand very intentionally, and he's telling his followers, if you want to be with me, you'll have to accept my version of reality. This is something Vladimir Putin does every day with his followers, too. If you want to be with me, you've got to make a choice to accept my version of reality. And it's one of the most disturbing parts of all this for me. Given the ready access to reliable information that we all have, the only way that this unreality tactic works in the United States today is through the intentional complicity of the people who choose to live in Trump's reality. They watch Fox News or OAN or whatever other cesspool of disinformation that they're swimming in because they want to believe Donald Trump. And I just can't imagine. It makes me sad, again, to think how broken a person would have to be inside, or how afraid, or how hateful, to choose to accept Donald Trump's reality as their own. And when I see that 80% of white evangelicals, again, are still choosing to live in Donald Trump's sick reality, they're turning on Fox News every day to hear his version of reality, it tells me that the brokenness in my old movement just goes so much deeper than I ever knew. And so that leads me to the fourth fascist tactic that Trump used in this press conference, propaganda. It's closely related to unreality, of course, but Jason Stanley points out what makes fascist propaganda specifically fascist. He says fascist propaganda is based around a friend-enemy distinction, and this is super important. Friend-enemy distinction. The political opponent is a merciless threat to your very existence. The political opponent. So, we see this, of course, this version of propaganda in almost every statement that Trump makes. He is, I think, the most hateful man in America. There might be some other one somewhere, but I haven't been introduced to them. And I assume that that's why he chooses to lead as a fascist. The way he talks about the other, it is a strategy, but I think it emanates from his own brokenness. And so he made several statements in that news conference about his enemies. And, sometimes it was minority youths or homeless people or elected Democrats. He said things like, this dire public safety crisis stems directly from the abject failures of the city's local leadership. The radical left city council adopted no cash bail. And he said, and that's why they want men playing in women's sports. That's why they want transgender for everybody. So it's just these ad hominem attacks against anyone who opposes him. And, he also said, they turned our nation's capital into a sanctuary jurisdiction, sanctuary for criminals, releasing illegal alien gang members onto the streets. And he also said, our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs, and homeless people. And we're not going to let it happen anymore. I'm pretty sure Stephen Miller wrote that part, by the way. But you get the point. And do I really have to explain to people who call themselves Christians just how wrong it is to support a man and a movement that's built around this sort of rhetoric about the enemy? I mean, apparently I do. Apparently I do have to tell people this because, 80% and all that I keep saying. So anyway, the fifth tactic, the final of those 10 that Jason Stanley lays out, the fifth one that Trump used yesterday is this well-worn Sodom and Gomorrah messaging. And it's all about urban decadence and rural purity. And just as a side note, this is one of the many reasons I hate most modern pop country music. I love a lot of the country music I grew up on, and I love a lot of sort of alternative country music that I listen to today. But this modern pop country music, I'll save it. I'll make a video about that someday. But the whole rural purity thing, Jason Stanley says that in fascist rhetoric, the cities are where there's decadence, where there's immigrants, there's criminality, there's Sodom and Gomorrah. The pure, hardworking, real members of the nations live in the rural areas. And so you'll hear Trump hit this theme again and again. And in this news conference yesterday, he said, these cities have become hellholes. We can't allow that to spread. And we're not going to let D.C. be another failed city. And if you've listened to him at all, you've heard him say this kind of stuff about cities. And it's just straight out of the fascist handbook for how to drive a wedge. And this one really bugs me on a personal level because I grew up in the country. I grew up in rural Minnesota. And someday I should do a video where I just talk about my redneck credentials, because I think I could stack my country roots and the things that I did, the parts of that lifestyle that I grew up in, I think I could stack that up against anyone's. And when I first came to the city to go to college, I was sure that I'd move back to the country in a few years, but I've lived in the city for almost 40 years now, and I love it. And I take Trump's attacks on the city personally, especially when he attacks Minneapolis. The George Floyd murder was tragic, and we've had several other incidents that we've had to deal with. But it's offensive to hear Trump's ignorant, hateful mumblings about the Twin Cities. I mean, as a St. Paul guy, I do see Minneapolis as just a slight step down from St. Paul, But I love Minneapolis, and my wife and I go across the river at least once a week, and we spend an evening at least once a week either in one of the parks in Minneapolis or one of the restaurants or the theaters that Minneapolis has. And as a resident of the Twin Cities, sure, I can attest that our politics can drive me nuts sometimes, but it's nothing like the way Trump describes us. And as beautiful as rural Minnesota is, and that's where I'm from and I love it, I experience a different kind of beauty in Minneapolis and in my own city of St. Paul. And I choose to live here because I've come to prefer urban life to rural life. But to each his own. I spent last weekend at a family farm, the farm of one of my family members. And we had a blast last weekend driving his Jeep through the woods and driving through the quarry on his farm and just visiting his neighbors. We went and visited a neighbor to hear how the neighbor kid did that night in his demolition derby. And we hung out in the garage and looked at the car and looked at the other cars that they're racing. And it was wonderful. And we just don't need someone like Donald Trump trying to drive a wedge. And I guess that's how I'm going to end it for today. Fascist tactics are all about driving a wedge and exploiting the petty hatreds and the grievances and the fears that people have against the other. As Jason Stanley says, it's the politics of us and them, the politics of us and them. And Donald Trump uses those tactics every day. He doesn't use those tactics because he's a fascist. He's a fascist because he uses those tactics. Fascism is as fascism does. And it's pretty sad, I think, that white evangelicals, I'll say it one more time, are the biggest reason why America is saddled with this creep. So that's all I've got to say about that. And thanks for listening.